What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and if you're enjoying the content that I'm uploading onto my channel, then feel free to subscribe, and you can also offer suggestions on topics and characters and storylines and whatnot that we can have discussions on later on in this channel. So as we continue our discussions on DC Rebirth, first things first, I am a little bit under the weather. And so if I sound sick, then it's simply because I apparently thought it was a good idea to go see Doctor Strange in 40-degree weather wearing shorts, and it turned out that was a bad decision. So I'm currently drowning myself in Theraflu, but hopefully I feel better here in the next few days or so. But what we do here is we pick up with Nightwing, the first story arc, which is technically called Better Than Batman. But in truth, I think this is really like the fall of Nightwing, because Tom Seeley really focuses on the notion that Nightwing's basically having a fall from grace, in the sense that he's moving away from Batman's teachings, and the path that he's chosen for himself is leading him down this road of presumably self-destruction. Now, the way that Tim Seeley does this is a little bit confusing. It's a little bit all over the place, but it doesn't take away from how good the story is. And so what we initially do here is we open up with a character named Dr. Leviticus. Now, as far as I'm aware, this is a wholly new creation. I don't think Dr. Leviticus has ever existed in any form prior to DC Rebirth. Now, we don't really know what it is that Dr. Leviticus is doing here. There seems to be a lot of reference with regards to the coins of the Boatman and Dr. Leviticus acquiring these coins for herself. Now, for those of you guys who don't know, in DC Comics, DC doesn't really shy away from the notion of real-world religion, which is to say the various religions that exist in the world. Now, when it comes to, Greek mythology, Roman mythology, so on and so forth, the belief system was that when a person died, they put coins on their eyes, or coins were put on their eyes so they could pay a toll to the boatman, so that when they could basically cross the river Styx and they could move to the afterlife. And there's a lot of allegories towards the Greek religion here, but somewhere along the line, in the midst of gathering these coins, suddenly Dr. Leviticus is met by the arrival of Raptor. Now, we're not initially told that this is Raptor, and we're actually going to learn a lot about him as we get through this video. But from here, we basically jump to Dick Grayson himself. Now, for those of you guys who have not seen my video on Nightwing Rebirth, the issue number 1 that sort of set the stage for his character, which you'll find down in the description, that basically established that in the New 52, we of course had Dick Grayson, who abandoned his mantle of Nightwing and became a spy. And this came out of fallout from the world believing that he was dead and so on. Of course, again, this is all explained in the Rebirth video, but the fact remains here that he's basically gone back to being Nightwing, to the world, basically knowing that he's still alive here. And for the most part, this was again tied into DC Rebirth itself, in the sense that for a lot of fans of DC Comics, Dick Grayson was synonymous with Nightwing. Of course, he took over the Nightwing mantle during the events around Crisis on Infinite Earths, and so to see him leave that mantle was something that was disappointing to a lot of people. And so in response, because of the fact that DC Rebirth was designed to combine what worked with the pre-New 52 alongside what worked in the New 52, the goal was to basically bridge this gap and to have him become Nightwing once again. The issue with this is that in the Rebirth story, in the initial story arc for Nightwing, we found out that instead of there simply being just a court of owls like we saw in Scott Snyder's run on Batman, there was a parliament of owls, which was sort of this worldwide conglomerate of various owl agencies around the world, all of whom existed to carry out their will of world domination from behind the scenes. And so what happened here was that Damian Wayne had a bomb planted in his head for the purpose of the Parliament of Owls convincing Dick Grayson to join their ranks. Now again, all this really ties into Scott Snyder's Batman, due to the fact that during that run, Scott Snyder established that the Court of Owls would basically pick a child who was relatively young, and they would groom that child to become an assassin over the course of their life, so that when that child died, they would in turn be given a substance of sorts called electrum, and that would course through their veins and basically reanimate them. Now, of course, this electrum was something that was established over the course of their life, so that by the time they died, they'd be prepared for reanimation. In the case of Dick Grayson, it was a filling that was planted in his tooth, so that the electrum would basically course through his veins, and then eventually, by the time he died again, he would be able to be reanimated to become a Talon and operate on behalf of the Court of Owls. The problem with this was that because the Gotham Court had been defeated by Batman, it left the slate open, but it also left the Parliament to pursue Dick Grayson for 2 reasons. The first was that because he was originally supposed to be a Talon before Batman figured out what was going on, and the second was because if the Parliament could not get Batman, Dick Grayson was the next best thing. And this is basically DC telling us that when it comes to the different people who have been Robin, Carrie Kelly, Stephanie Brown, Tim Drake, Jason Todd, and even Damian Wayne himself, that Dick Grayson is the most capable. Dick Grayson is the closest to being Batman Batman from any of these characters. Now, this doesn't mean that he's like a better fighter than Damian Wayne. What it does mean is that he is most in tune with how it is that Batman functions by way of his combat skills, by way of his detective skills. And so Dick Grayson is the closest we are ever going to get. Now, again, because of this, because Dick Grayson had basically been shanghaied into working as part of the Parliament of Owls, the goal here was to take it down from within. And so during his time as part of the Parliament, he had basically taken on different tasks, and he had done his job to effectively lead them to believe that he was working with them, albeit unwillingly. And so what we do is we jump to the Batcave. Now, this is an extremely important part of the story because this initially gives us the beginning steps that Dick Grayson takes leading towards his downfall. During a training session between Bruce Wayne and his son Damian, Dick Grayson is basically watching these events unfold, and of course he's giving Damian different tips on how to overcome Batman, on how to counter his various moves and so on. But once the conflict between Damian and Bruce is finished, once they're done training, he sends Damian on his way and he starts talking to Dick Grayson. Now, Dick Grayson initially says, hey, look, like my goal here is to take down the Parliament of Owls, and Bruce Wayne knows this. And Bruce Wayne says, hey, look, I trust you enough that you're gonna make the right calls here. Do whatever you need to do. I will fund whatever it is that you need to have funded. Now, the fact that Bruce Wayne trusts Dick Grayson here is a huge thing, but the trust is limited in the sense that Bruce Wayne never really trusts anybody. Like, he wouldn't necessarily trust someone on a personal level the way you and I would trust them. He trusts Dick Grayson only insofar that, sure, he would, trust Dick Grayson with his life, but only insofar that he keeps Dick Grayson at arm's length, so that if Dick Grayson died, it wouldn't destroy Bruce Wayne's ability to be Batman. It wouldn't send everything crashing down. Now, a lot of this really stems from the death of Jason Todd, right? In the original Death in the Family story arc, it stems from the idea that Jason Todd had effectively been killed by the Joker, and the idea was that Batman didn't want to fall in that situation again. And so following that point going forward, he always kept all of his different sidekicks at arm's length. Now, what we also do from here is we transition to Burnside Bridge with Barbara Gordon. Now, the funny thing about this is that Tim Seeley is basically setting the stage, or at least as far as I'm aware, setting the stage for a romance between Barbara Gordon and Dick Grayson. I wouldn't say I'm that well versed in their characters to know whether or not they've been in a relationship before. I know that there was a huge thing with regards to Barbara Gordon being Oracle and so on, but I know that with DC Rebirth, they're changing things, they're altering a few things. I know that the Oracle landscape still remain, but for those of you guys who are more versed in Dick Grayson and Barbara Gordon than I am, feel free to post down in the description. Again, I know that there has been some measure of relationship between the two of them, but as far as I'm aware, DC Rebirth is the first time that DC is going back and revisiting that relationship between the two of them. But the fact remains here that he basically tells Barbara, here's what I'm going, here's what I'm doing. I'm taking off. I'm going to be working alongside the the Parliament of Owls. I've got to be away for a time. And Barbara is basically telling him, that's fine, but if you do this, do not fall over the edge. You're basically walking this line between what you can do and what you can't do, what makes you a hero and what makes you a villain. And it's in our nature as vigilantes to do that. But we, as members of the Bat family and as people who have been trained by Batman, we know not to fall over that edge. And she's afraid Dick Grayson is going to. She's afraid that Dick Grayson is going to cross a line that he can't come back from. And so because of this, as he's in the midst of pondering, his thoughts with Barbara Gordon, as he's in the midst of pondering the relationship that the two of them may have relatively soon, we're ultimately met with the arrival of Raptor. Now again, Raptor has been assigned to Dick Grayson as a partner. And even Dick Grayson himself, during his meeting with the Parliament, was told, you are going to have a partner in the form of Raptor and you will do what we tell you to. Now, Tim Seeley kind of dances around a little bit. He doesn't really tell us whether or not the Parliament knows that Dick Grayson wants to bring them down, but it likely seems that they do, in the sense that if they are aware of this, they believe they have Dick Grayson under their thumb, which means that he doesn't really have an opportunity to do what he can to take them down. Instead, he's just basically doing what they tell him to do. But the idea between Raptor and Dick Grayson meeting for the first time is effectively living up to the title of the story, in the sense that Raptor says, look, man, Batman says that you guys need the fear of criminals in order to achieve your goals. You guys need criminals to be afraid of you. Batman's wrong. It's not a matter of being, the criminals being afraid of you. Even if they are afraid of you, they're still going to be criminals. Otherwise, if that measure was successful, there would never be criminals. And so what he says is, it's not enough to have them be afraid of you. You have to be willing to kill them if it comes down to it. You have to be willing to do things that you wouldn't normally do. And again, this is basically, sort of Dick Grayson falling from grace. This is the idea of Tim Seeley telling us that Dick Grayson is starting to fall down this path, that he's starting to move towards this direction of becoming a much darker person than he should be. And so from here, Tim Seeley starts to, or at least it seems like what he's doing, is moving into left field, kind of coming out of nowhere with the reintroduction of Cobra. Now, for a lot of you guys who don't know, Cobra is an organization that's been around some time, and so for those of you who are familiar with Cobra, bear with me for a second. When it came to DC Comics, Cobra was an organization very similar to Scott Snyder's Court of Owls. The difference here is that the Cobra organization wanted a more direct approach to taking over the world, whereas the Court of Owls, or the Parliament of Owls, wanted to work behind the scenes. The Cobra, as it was originally established in 1976, I think it was, prior to Crisis on Infinite Earths, was an organization that was led by a guy named Jeffrey Burr. And the philosophy of Cobra was that they wanted to bring about an age of chaos, which basically meant removing the landscape of the world as it existed now, the various organizations, governments, so on and so forth, and replacing it with their own perspective or their own view of how the world should be. With the Parliament of Owls, they focus more behind the scenes, controlling the world as it is, by either using blackmail or using threats, bribes, what have you, to basically control some of the most influential and powerful people in the world at the moment. Now, of course, they have their own talents to execute those individuals who don't follow their own path, and that's really what Dick Grayson and Raptor are at the moment. They're basically talents, but they're not traditional talents, in the sense that the traditional talents are basically the dead who are resurrected and operate as henchmen with absolute subservience to the court themselves. But the notion here, or at least as is told to us by Raptor, is that Cobra had basically been using gene therapy, and this is where things get a little bit murky. During this time when Jeffrey Burr was running Cobra, he also had a lover of sorts named Lady Eve, and Lady Eve had actually turned against him and formed her own splinter faction of Cobra. So it's very similar to what happened with Hydra in Marvel Comics, in the sense that you had the original Hydra, which was a combination of the Hand and Nazi Germany, and then you had Hydra that splintered off and formed its own organization called Advanced Idea Mechanics. But the goal here was for Hydra to basically use their influence to control the world and again bring about this age of chaos. The problem was eventually Jeffrey Burr was killed by Black Adam, and so the powers that be within the Cobra organization came to the conclusion that if Jeffrey Burr had been killed, then it was obvious he was not the one that was going to lead them into this age of chaos. And so they decided that the other person, or the best person suited for this, was Jeffrey's twin brother, Jason Burr. Now this is where things get a little weird, because for those of you guys who are really familiar with the more obscure aspects of DC Comics like Cobra, then you could probably correct me on this, but as far as I know, DC never really did anything with Jason Burr. They just kind of made him a guy who was able to use these different facets of magic in the DC universe and was really just kind of moving around in a clandestine organization, or a clandestine way, bolstering their ranks, but that was really about it. And so Tim Seeley coming back, and we'll actually find at the end of the story, is he'll reintroduce Lady Eve. But what Tim Seeley's doing is saying that Cobra still very much exists. The difference here, I guess another aspect here, is that Cobra is using what's called gene therapy. Now again, a lot of this is coming from a combination of, Dick Grayson's inner monologue as well as information that's being provided by Raptor. And what he says is that by using gene therapy, they're basically turning human beings into assassins that function at the behest of Cobra. The problem with this is that Cobra couldn't just take anybody and have them operate as agents. The reason being that if they just were to randomly kidnap a person off the street, then their brother or their sister or their mother or their father or whatever the case may be would come asking questions. They'd report the fact that they're missing to the authorities. And so what Cobra did instead is they basically started kidnapping people that nobody would miss. People who were homeless, people who were without a home, people who were refugees, different things like that. People that nobody would ask questions on where they had gone to, on why they were missing. Now, one of the kickers to this is that because they were using gene therapy, they would effectively transmogrify them into agents of Cobra. And so because of this, because of the fact that Cobra was for all intents and purposes an enemy of the Parliament of Owls, we learned this is the entire basis of the mission. The basis of the mission was to basically take away Cobra's ability to acquire its own assassins by handing those people over to the Parliament of Owls, and in turn, those individuals would actually be turned into Talons later on down the line. And so this is really just Dick Grayson and Raptor operating as henchmen as part of just a massive power struggle between two organizations, both of whom want to take over the world. Now from here, we also continue this journey with Dick Grayson falling down the rabbit hole, in the sense that because these people were just handed over to the Parliament, and because Dick Grayson knew that they were going to be turned into Talons at some point down the line, it creates a rift between himself and Raptor, in the sense that Raptor says, hey, look man, this is the long game. This is the way it's done. Yes, you could have saved them, but the problem is that if you would have saved these people, it would have raised red flags. Not only that, there would have been countless others that you would have had to save as well. The problem that comes when you start making these rules, and the idea that you have to save everybody, is the line drawing. Where do you stop? who deserves to save, and who deserves to be saved and who doesn't deserve to be saved. At what point do you sit down and recognize that you have to sacrifice a few in order to save the many? But Dick Grayson doesn't want to hear this, because this goes directly in contradiction with his goal on, as far as Batman is concerned. With his training by Batman, it was always solve the problem right now. If you can save people right now, save them, and then deal with the aftermath later on. But what Raptor is saying is you can't operate this way. You can't function this way and be an adequate, superhero. Instead, you have to be willing to sacrifice a handful of people now so that you could save countless people later on down the line, or even the world as it exists. And so what we do is we transition for a second with Barbara Gordon, because again, Dick Grayson has said, hey, this is only going to be a short mission. I'll only be gone for a few days or so. I'll be back. And Barbara had actually set things up waiting for a date, but the fact that Dick Grayson didn't show immediately gives her some measure of concern. And so ultimately we find that with Dick Grayson effectively vanishing, or him having been gone, that while Raptor and Dick are meeting with, preparing to head into a labyrinth that was created by a guy named Mr. Rude, or at least they call him Newt Rude, I think is how you pronounce it, but it's Rude's madhouse, that Barbara Gordon shows up. And so because of her concern for Dick Grayson, because of the idea that she wants to make sure that he's not falling down this rabbit hole of self-destruction, she's effectively kind of a guiding light here. And if we were to read between the lines, Tim Seeley is basically showing us that this is what's happening, that Dick Grayson is walking a knife's edge. On one side, he can come back. He hasn't quite fallen yet. He can come back and he can follow Barbara Gordon, and he can go back to the way things used to be as part of the Bat family, doing the best that he can to save as many people as he can. But on the other side, you have Raptor, and he could fall down this hole and join Raptor by stepping into the darkness. Now, Barbara Gordon fighting against Raptor is kind of like this metaphorical situation, of Dick Grayson's internal struggle, so to speak, with regards to him trying to choose a light or the dark. But ultimately, it seems as though he sides with Barbara Gordon and saying that, hey, look, I'm just doing what needs to be done for the moment. I'm not becoming a bad guy. I'm not becoming a villain. I'm not becoming a terrible human being. I'm just trying to save lives as best I can. More so than that, what he says is the key to bringing down the Parliament of Owls lies in Newt Rude's house. That according to the stories that we're told, that, Mr. Rude was basically given a tarot reading by a woman who said that he was going to be killed by someone. And so in order to prevent this from happening, he had basically turned his house into this insane labyrinth that nobody would be able to navigate through, thereby basically keeping himself alive by remaining a shut-in the entire time in a maze that would be almost impossible to navigate. And so he says that within this maze is a blueprint for how to defeat the Parliament of Owls. And so if they can access this blueprint, they can turn around and they can use it to take down the Parliament. And this is basically Dick Grayson saying, this is the goal that I've been working for. This is what I've been trying to achieve. Now, what we're going to find over the course or over the remainder of the second half of this story is that Dick Grayson's tunnel vision in trying to achieve this goal is effectively going to be his downfall. But once they make their way into this house and they begin navigating around the various puzzles and so on and so forth, once they seem to get through this labyrinth, Raptor immediately takes off. And as soon as he does, Nightwing and Barbara Gordon chase after him, and they find that he's basically killed Newt Rude. And so contact is made with the Parliament of Owls, and they say, hey, Newt Rude has been killed. Whatever it is that he was holding on to that you guys didn't want him to have is no longer an issue. No one's going to be able to get in here. No one's going to be able to access his information or access what it is that's owed to him. Now, of course, during this entire conversation, Nightwing is freaking out and he's attacking Raptor. But once the meeting with the Parliament of Owls is over, then Raptor says, okay, that's enough. And we learn that Newt Rude's not actually dead. Instead, the entire thing was designed to be a ruse. And Raptor seems to have had the exact same goal as Nightwing did, in the sense of trying to access this information in an effort to bring down the Parliament of Owls. Now, of course, Barbara Gordon is none too happy about all this. And the idea here is that, again, she swears an absolute allegiance to the teachings of Batman, in the sense that, inspiring fear is what motivates people to do the right thing. It's what motivates people to stop being criminals, not messing with their minds, not toying with them, not putting them on the verge of dying. And so again, this is basically Barbara showing us that, hey, look, you're going down a path, or at least Dick Grayson is going down a path that she can't follow. She can't continue with him on his journey like this, because he's ignoring everything he's been taught. He's blowing off the entire moral compass that he has for the purpose of trying to achieve this singular goal. And the argument that Barbara Gordon makes here is, of what use is taking down the Parliament of Owls if you lose yourself in the process? And And that's a very legitimate question here. That's a very legitimate, situation for Dick Grayson, because he may very well lose himself in this. If he ends up, destroying his entire moral compass in the goal of trying to take down the Parliament, then of what use was it? Because the one thing that we know, the one thing that Barbara Gordon tells him is that sure, you might take down the Parliament, but somebody else will rise up against them, or somebody else will rise up in their place. And if you're no longer the superhero who's capable of taking them down using appropriate measures, then what are you going to do in that situation? Are you just going to fall to the point where you just start killing people who get in the way, in which case you basically just become a bad guy here? And so what we do is we pick up with Raptor as he takes Dick Grayson to meet Dr. Leviticus. Now again, we had seen Dr. Leviticus at the beginning of all this, but we didn't really know what direction things had gone. But what Dr. Leviticus says is that she was in effect the mastermind behind the means for the Parliament to begin the process of bringing people back from the dead using this sort of electrum. But she had also discovered that the Parliament would at some point along the line try to take her out because of the fact that they didn't want anybody to have the information on this process, which she could easily duplicate. And so what she did is she basically made a backup. She made a copy of this book that, this book of wisdom that the Parliament of Owls was using, and she encoded it on these little coins, these little coins that she was searching for, very similar to at least how they describe it as like a record, in the sense that you could basically decipher them, and then you could in turn access all the information inside of it. It's kind of like a living ledger, so to speak. And so because of this, she says, I am willing to give you guys this information so long as you give me a safe place to hide, as you give me somewhere to go to, that I won't have to worry about retaliation from the Parliament of Owls themselves. And so what we do is we jump with Dick Grayson and Raptor as we show up at the Parliament of Owls proper. And the issue here is that when they arrive, they're immediately told, hey, look, go out, enjoy yourselves. Tomorrow's going to be a very, very important day. We're not explicitly told why, but it seems to be the first step that the Parliament's taking in executing their grand plans for domination over the world. And suddenly we have, Dick Grayson and Raptor going through and freeing all these prisoners who had previously been taken there for the purpose of, basically doing the right thing. And so suddenly, while a couple individuals have seen what it is that Dick Grayson and Nightwing are doing, they are met, or I guess, when they report to the Order and say, hey, look, here's what's going on. They report to the head honcho, they tell them what's happening. This person kills those two individuals from the Parliament and then reveals himself to be Moloch. Now, to be honest here, when I initially picked up, when I was initially going through this, my thought was, is this a reference to Moloch the Mystic from the Watchmen series? Because Moloch the Mystic was a major part of the original line of stories before Watchmen, so on and so forth, that dealt with the events that took place before the Watchmen story. But as I went through here, I realized this is really just kind of a play on words. Tim Seeley is not really bringing back Moloch the Magician from Watchmen, but I thought it was important to bring that about because we have so much Watchmen content being injected into DC Rebirth. We have Dr. Manhattan, we have presumably Ozymandias, a lot of things going on behind the scenes regarding the Watchmen being incorporated in. But as it turns out, this is really just kind of like a giant owl monster sort of thing, whose sole purpose is to eliminate Nightwing and Raptor. That's really the only purpose this thing serves. And so while the two of them are able to eliminate this giant monster, because of the fact that Raptor is incapable of feeling any kind of pain, incapable of feeling emotion or anything along those lines, that they are successful in beating Moloch, but the result is that he's actually injured in the process and is severely bleeding out. And so the indication here for Dick Grayson is that Raptor is effectively dying. And so while he is able to get his hands on this book, as it's been written, by, or I guess as it's been covered by Dr. Leviticus, ultimately he's sent on his way by Raptor. He's told to get out of there. And so Raptor's, presumably goes off on his own, and Dick Grayson goes off on his own as well, although we're not initially told what happens to Raptor. Now, picking up with Dick Grayson, we ultimately follow him once he arrives back at the Batcave, and we have him speaking with Batman, where he basically says that the information in that book has been handed over to Spiral, which is the spy organization he'd been working for, and Spiral was going to decrypt this book, and then they were going to take the information as they decrypted it, handed it to the authorities as a way to basically bring down the various puppets that work as part of the Parliament of Owls in hopes that they can actually take down the Parliament of Owls itself. Now again, this is why I say this is really Dick Grayson falling, in his entirety, because he almost seemingly rejects all the teachings that Batman had given him. When Batman says it was reckless of you to trust Raptor like that, it was reckless of you to believe that he was somebody that you could actually relate to because you don't know him. Dick Grayson says, yeah, but it was a calculated risk and it benefited because we basically achieved our mission. We found a way to take down the Parliament of Owls. We have our own goals here and we were successful in what it was that we were achieving. And so the risk was worth the reward. It was basically the question of, is the juice worth the squeeze? And so because of this, he says the the way in which you function, Batman, the way in which you work doesn't work. You know, your teachings don't work as well as they could. I found a better way. I found another way. And so he says, you know, I'm not you. And it effectively seems as though Dick Grayson is walking away from Batman. Now, following this, we transition back again to Raptor and the idea that Cobra wants to bring about, you know, the Kali Yuga, basically the age of chaos. And we learn that Raptor was actually working for Cobra Cult the entire time. Not only that, while the goal of Raptor was to basically acquire this book and allow Dick Grayson to send it off to the authorities, that Dr. Leviticus had installed a back door, which meant that as this decoding process took place by Spiral, everything that Spiral decoded would be sent to Cobra as well as to the authorities, meaning that Cobra would always be a step ahead and they would always be able to influence those various people, either turning them into, you know, members of, you know, the snake race operating on behalf of Cobra, or else just bending them to the will of Cobra in order to achieve their own goals. And so it was more or less operating a subterfuge, allowing Cobra to overtake, you know, the Court of Owls in their quest for world domination. So when the question is asked, what are they going to do about Nightwing? We learned that the true motivation here of Raptor was to basically trick Dick Grayson, was to, you know, to get Dick Grayson to believe that they were on the same side, ultimately allowing Raptor to make the case that he has Dick Grayson wrapped around his finger, presumably for some future, you know, betrayal or some way to remove Nightwing from the picture in its entirety. But with that being said, we're going to bring this video to an end. If you guys are new here to Comics Explained, be sure to hit the sub button and become part of the Rob Corps. And also make sure you guys drop a like if you enjoyed this video and leave a comment down below. Let me know what you guys think about this. I know this isn't usually on par with the regular videos, but again, I'm feeling pretty sick here, so doing the best I can. It's a little rough when my brain's all fuzzy and everything. But anyway, guys, yeah, we're gonna go ahead and wrap this up. Now we'll catch you all later. Peace.